Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. Hey there. Go ahead, get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights, loosen that blanket, and put the world on pause for a bit. Tonight, we're not diving into kings or wars or scandals. Well, not yet. We're starting somewhere smaller, softer, grittier, actually. Because tonight's story begins with sand. Yes, sand. That humble stuff between your toes at the beach. Or, if you were a Renaissance scribe, between your fingers. Sprinkled carefully over fresh ink so your masterpiece didn't smudge into an expensive blur. The kind of sand that made the difference between a letter that survived centuries and one that turned into an inky Rorschach test. So, settle in. This one's slow, a bit dusty, and smells faintly of old parchment and human frustration. It's easy to romanticize the Renaissance. You picture golden light spilling through arched windows, quills scratching in perfect rhythm, scholars in velvet robes murmuring Latin. But reality was a lot messier. Writing back then was a test of patience and posture. You'd dip your quill into ink that was supposed to flow like poetry but often behaved like soup. You'd carefully drag it across your paper, or vellum if you were fancy, and hope it didn't blot. And once you were done, you couldn't just blow on it. That was barbaric. No self-respecting scholar puffed over their parchment like a peasant trying to cool porridge. Instead, you reached for a small container, a sand shaker or Pounce pot. Inside it, a fine grainy powder, usually ground pumice, cuttlefish bone, or very clean, sifted sand. You'd hold it over your still wet ink and give it a gentle shake. The effect was almost magical. The sand absorbed moisture and sped up the drying process. Then, after a few seconds, or a few moments, if your handwriting resembled medieval spaghetti, you'd tilt the page and let the sand tumble off. Some fell back into the pot. Some inevitably ended up in your sleeve, or your soup, or your manuscript margins for eternity. But this wasn't a one-size-fits-all affair. Different writers had different drying rituals. Monks, ever methodical, often used pumice mixed with chalk, which also smoothed their rough parchment before writing. Wealthy merchants preferred finely ground white sand imported from Venice, because of course they did. Even their ink-drying habits had to be fashionable. Let's pause for a second and talk about why ink drying was such a big deal. If you were writing in the Renaissance, you weren't typing emails or texting someone who'd forget your message in 2 minutes. You were producing documents that might survive for generations, or get you executed if you made the wrong flourish in the wrong name. Ink back then was temperamental. Most was made from oak gall, the knobby little growths formed on oak leaves by wasps. These were crushed and mixed with iron salts, gum, arabic, and water. It produced a dark, rich ink that soaked deeply into parchment. Great for permanence, not so great for drying time. It could stay wet for hours in humid weather. Now imagine copying a 300-page manuscript. Your hand cramps. Your eyes blur. You finally finish a page, and the ink just sits there, gleaming wetly, taunting you. One careless move, one errant sleeve, and the whole thing smears. You start again, possibly swearing in Latin. So yes, sand wasn't just helpful, it was sanity. The sand trade itself became a quiet, profitable niche in the Renaissance economy. Merchants sold pounce in little ceramic pots with decorative tops, tiny holes like a salt shaker. Some were simple, others made from silver or carved bone, because why not make your ink drying accessories ridiculously fancy? In Venice, records mention Pounce merchants operating near the Rio. They sold powders not only for drying ink, but also for preparing parchment and paper. England had them too. London stationers stocked fine sand alongside ink, wax, and quills. And of course, people had opinions about which sand worked best. Italian scribes swore by pale river sand from Padua. The French liked their sand mixed with crushed eggshells. The Germans, in predictably practical fashion, just used whatever sand was cheapest. But let's be honest, this whole sand routine was not elegant. It got everywhere. Contemporary complaints sound eerily modern, like the Renaissance version of glitter. You'd sprinkle some on your letter, tap the page, and no matter how careful you were, little grains would cling stubbornly to the corners. They'd find their way into book bindings, margins, even the folds of your clothes. Some scribes tried blowing the sand away despite etiquette frowning on it. But that usually meant blowing it straight into your own face. There's a story, probably exaggerated, about a Florentine notary who sneezed mid-drying and covered an entire legal document in specks of damp grit. His apprentice spent 2 hours brushing it clean with a feather. The document, incidentally, still exists in an archive. Faintly gritty 500 years later. Let's float for a moment into the life of one of these poor ink-stained souls. Picture a monk, maybe in 1470. Let's call him Brother Matteo. He's sitting in a chilly scriptorium, a candle guttering beside him. The air smells of parchment, wax, and mild despair. He's been copying sermons all morning. His quill keeps catching on the page. He sighs, dips, writes a few more lines, and then reaches for his sandpot. It's a small clay thing, probably chipped. He shakes it gently over the page, waits, and then tilts it to pour the sand back. He's done this thousands of times, so many that it's almost meditative. But one day, perhaps out of boredom, he experiments. He mixes his drying sand with a pinch of crushed lavender, just to make his workspace smell less like boiled sheep. The result? Pleasant aroma, faint purple tint, mild panic when his abbot notices. Innovation wasn't exactly encouraged. Still, there's something soothing about the image. Matteo and his sand, slowly building eternity, one grain at a time. Ink drying, though, wasn't just about patience. It was also about technology creeping forward, painfully, slowly. By the late 1400s, Europe was falling in love with paper. It was cheaper than parchment, smoother, and didn't require skinning any animals. But paper had one annoying problem. It absorbed ink differently. The same oak gall ink that worked beautifully on vellum often feathered or smeared on paper. So writers started using Pounce before they wrote, dusting their paper lightly to roughen the surface and control the ink's spread. Then, after writing, they'd use sand again to dry it. 2 rounds of dusting. Twice the mess. If you're wondering when blotting paper came along to rescue everyone, that wouldn't happen for centuries. The earliest mention of blotting paper dates to the late 15th century, but it didn't become common until much later. Until then, sand reigned supreme. Let's drift to Leonardo da Vinci for a second, because of course he shows up in every Renaissance story, whether he belongs there or not. Leonardo, famously left-handed, wrote his notes in mirror script. One reason he may have done this? to avoid smudging his ink as his hand moved across the page. Right-handers didn't have this problem. Lefties, like Leo, did. And since sand only helped after you wrote, it didn't fix the smudge issue mid-sentence. Imagine the greatest mind of the Renaissance, constantly battling damp ink and awkward wrist angles. He probably used Pounce like everyone else, but still ended up with fingertips permanently stained black, back in the more mundane world. Every letter written, every document signed, depended on that moment of drying. In royal courts, secretaries had servants whose entire job was to manage writing tools, clean the quills, prepare the ink, and yes, handle the sand. Imagine being the official sand boy in the court of Francis I of France, a man whose legacy includes magnificent art and at least 3 cases of syphilis. You, meanwhile, are responsible for shaking sand over his love letters and hoping you don't spill any on his signature. These small rituals, invisible today, shaped how communication even looked. The slightly grainy texture of Renaissance ink on paper, the faint sparkle you sometimes see under old light. That's Pounce residue, still clinging there after 500 years. Little fossils of bureaucracy, and then, gradually, sand lost its throne as printing took over and industrial paper improved. Ink formulas changed. By the 18th century, faster-drying inks and absorbent paper made sand obsolete. Blotting paper appeared, clean, efficient, and far less crunchy. People moved on. The Pounce pots ended up as curiosities, sitting on desks as reminders of a dustier past. But if you've ever seen an old desk, maybe in a museum, the kind with drawers and little compartments, you'll notice a small round hole, sometimes next to the inkwell. That's where the sand shaker used to sit. It's a tiny architectural echo of a time when writing was slow enough for silence to matter. If you were a Renaissance scholar or clerk, your entire world could be summed up by 3 things: ink, paper, and time. You spent all day with the first 2, and you were constantly running out of the third. But no one ever seemed to hurry. Letters weren't dashed off in seconds the way we do now. Writing was a performance. Every line was deliberate. Every word was inked like it might someday be carved in stone. Even so, mistakes happened constantly. Ink blotted, sand stuck in the wrong place, a hand twitched at the wrong moment. You couldn't just crumple the page and start over. That sheet of paper had cost you a chunk of your week's wages. So instead, you'd carefully scrape away the mistake with a penknife, brush off the debris, smooth it with pumice, and try again. The result? A patchwork of effort. If you look closely at old manuscripts, you can still see the scars, tiny thin patches where the ink looks paler. Each one tells a little story of human error, quietly fixed with sand, patience, and resignation. Now, if you were rich, say, a Florentine banker or a Venetian merchant, you didn't write your own letters. You had a scribe for that. The scribe's job was simple but relentless: produce perfect handwriting at speed every single day. And that meant living with ink stains, calloused fingers, and sand in your hair. These men, and occasionally women, knew their materials like chefs, no ingredients. They could tell good paper by touch. They could smell when ink had soured. And they had a sixth sense for how much sand was too much. Sprinkle too little, and the ink smeared. Too much, and the writing lost its gloss, the pigment dulling under the grit. The ideal, just enough to kiss the ink dry. Scribes also kept different grades of sand for different clients. A prince's letter deserved fine, pale sand that wouldn't show specks on creamy paper. A merchant's account book could use coarser grains. Nobody cared what his totals looked like as long as they added up. One thing people forget is how noisy writing used to be. There's a myth that old libraries were silent. But if you'd walked into a scriptorium or a Renaissance study, you'd hear a whole orchestra of sound. Quills scratching, sand pots shaking, parchment crackling, firewood popping, pages turning. It was a texture of quiet work. Monks coughed softly. Someone muttered over a Latin phrase. Someone else sneezed, inevitably scattering sand everywhere. And in those sounds, there was rhythm. Writing wasn't just mental labor, it was physical, musical even. The sand punctuated the process, like a soft percussion instrument marking the end of a passage. A page finished, a small pause, a shake, a sigh. Not everyone used sand the same way. Across Europe, habits varied with climate and culture. In the warm, damp cities of Italy, ink dried slowly. Venetian merchants swore by sand with tiny bits of powdered marble. It absorbed moisture and looked elegant. In drier climates like Spain, ink dried faster, so some scribes skipped the sand altogether, relying on the air. Northern Europe, with its endless damp chill, clung to Pounce longer than anyone else. Even when printing presses began to dominate, clerks in England and Germany were still shaking their little pots of grit well into the 1700s. There's something stubbornly poetic about that. The world was modernizing, but some habits refused to die. Let's wander for a minute to a Renaissance desk, say, the one belonging to a scholar in Florence around 1505. It's early morning. Light slants through a window, catching dust in the air. The desk is cluttered but orderly. Ink bottle, quill stand, wax seal, a small knife, and beside it all, the sand pot. The pot's lid is carved with little holes in a geometric pattern, slightly clogged from yesterday's work. A faint shimmer of sand dust coats the wood around it. He's writing a letter to a patron. Flattering, but not too flattering, because the Renaissance had its politics even in compliments. His hand moves slowly, his ink dark and smooth. When he finishes a line, he pauses, lifts the sand pot, shakes it gently, then waits. The sand lands softly, like tiny raindrops. He tilts the paper, taps it once, twice, then brushes the residue aside with the back of his hand. For a moment, he stares at his words. Maybe he feels a small pride in them. Maybe he just thinks about breakfast. Either way, the ritual continues, quiet and steady, the same as it was for 1,000 other hands across Europe. The funny thing is, sand wasn't even the only option. There were people experimenting with everything, ash, flour, even ground up coral. Someone in 16th century Spain recommended powdered eggshells, mixed with salt for superior drying and whiteness. Someone else swore by finely sifted brick dust. A few recipes called for dust from a clean floor, which feels both practical and horrifying. Renaissance people didn't waste anything. If it was grainy and absorbent, it probably ended up sprinkled over some poor clerk's half-dry letter. Still, sand was the classic. Dependable, cheap, universally available. It never went bad, and best of all, it worked now. You might be wondering, why didn't they just wave the page around? Well, they did. But that was considered risky. Swinging a half-wet sheet of parchment near an open flame or another manuscript was a gamble you only made once. And again, blowing on it wasn't seen as polite. It suggested impatience, maybe even bad manners. Gentlemen and scholars didn't blow. They sprinkled because dignity must be maintained, even when dealing with inky fingers. Plus, there was symbolism in the ritual. Sand represented control, a measured shake, a calculated weight. In an age obsessed with order, that small, tactile act of sprinkling dust over wet words felt proper. It's oddly fitting, isn't it? Words born in liquid, sealed in dust. And of course, not all sand was created equal. The ideal grains were small, round, and clean, too coarse, and they left indentations, too fine, and they clumped. The best scribes washed and dried their sand before use. Some baked it to remove moisture. There are even 15th century manuals describing how to sift pounce through silk for fine letters and through linen for common work. Imagine caring that much about drying ink. But that was the Renaissance for you, an age where art, science, and pedantry all held hands. People obsessed over ink formulas the same way modern people obsess over coffee brewing methods. You didn't just use ink, you curated it, and sand was part of that ecosystem of obsession. Over time, as the Renaissance rolled on, Pounce pots themselves became miniature works of art. Wealthy writers commissioned silver or pewter pots engraved with initials or family crests. Some were shaped like shells, some like small towers. A few had lids inlaid with gemstones, because nothing says refined taste like sprinkling sand through a ruby-studded lid. One Venetian merchant reportedly had a set of matching desk accessories made from coral and ivory, an inkwell, quill holder, and sand pot, all lined with gold. He probably spent more on that set than his clerk earned in a decade. Of course, that same clerk would have been the one actually using it, carefully shaking sand over letters he'd never sign himself. And speaking of clerks, they developed all sorts of tricks to speed things up. Some would write several pages in rotation, one drying while the next was being inked. Others tilted their desks slightly so sand rolled off more easily. A few, in particularly humid climates, placed candles or embers near the writing surface to warm the paper just enough to help ink set faster. Dangerous, yes, but effective. Then there were the perfectionists, the ones who couldn't stand even the faintest grain of sand left behind. They used soft brushes, often made from squirrel hair, to gently sweep away residue. Some even polished finished pages lightly with silk cloth. The result was a smooth, gleaming surface, the text sitting slightly raised, tactile and permanent. It's easy to imagine those pages now, resting behind glass in some museum, visitors peering in and thinking, wow, look at that handwriting, never realizing the real story is in the invisible grit that made it possible. Even today, if you examine Renaissance manuscripts under a microscope, you can sometimes find tiny fragments of sand embedded in the fibers. They're still there, 500 years later, ghosts of the drying process. Each grain once touched by a human hand, shaken from a little pot, doing its job in complete silence. That's what I love about these small stories. They remind you that history isn't just kings and wars. It's also sand. It's a tired hand at dusk. It's someone pausing to make sure their words won't smudge before they go to dinner. That's the humanity in it. The part that still feels familiar, even through all the centuries of dust. Hey, again. Still awake? Good, because tonight we're trading sand for sludge. Thick, black, beautiful sludge. Renaissance ink. If you've ever seen those graceful old letters, the kind where every stroke looks deliberate and somehow more intelligent than anything written today. You're looking at the product of controlled chaos. Ink making back then wasn't science. It was witchcraft with better handwriting. Let's start with the basics. Most Renaissance ink was iron gall ink, the go-to recipe for Europe for nearly 1,000 years. It's still found on medieval manuscripts, Renaissance ledgers, royal decrees, and the odd grocery list written by a duke. The main ingredient, oak galls. These weren't nuts or seeds. They were weird knobbly growths that formed on oak trees when tiny wasps laid eggs inside the leaves. The tree, understandably annoyed, secreted chemicals around the wound, creating a hard, brown lump. People discovered that if you crushed those lumps and soaked them in water, you got a liquid rich in tannic acid. Mix that with iron salts, gum arabic, and a bit of wine or vinegar, and you had something dark enough to stain your soul. It sounds unappealing, and it was. The smell alone was like rusty vinegar and tree sap, but it worked beautifully. The ink went on faintly grey, then darkened as it oxidized, an alchemy that turned words into something permanent. The irony, it was so permanent that, centuries later, the acid in it actually started to eat through the paper. Manuscripts still crumble from it today. The Renaissance invented eternal ink, but forgot to make it kind. You might imagine a scholar in Florence, or maybe a monk up in the Alps, mixing this stuff by candlelight. They'd grind the oak galls with a pestle, soak them in rainwater for days, sometimes weeks, then strain the mixture through cloth. Add iron sulfate, scraped from rusting nails or mined from mineral deposits, and the potion would darken instantly. Gum arabic, that sticky resin from acacia trees, gave it body and kept it from soaking straight through the paper. It was messy, slow, and dangerous for your clothes. But when it worked, the result was elegance. The kind of black that seemed to shimmer blue in candlelight. Of course, everyone had their own secret recipe. Scholars guarded them the way chefs guard sauce formulas. Some added honey, some used beer instead of water. There's even a 15th century note suggesting that ink made with wine of fine age gave smoother lines. You can imagine the monk who discovered that rule probably discovered a hangover too. Ink wasn't just a tool, it was status. Cheap ink was thin, watery, brownish, prone to fading. That's what clerks used for ledgers or ordinary correspondence. Richer people, royal secretaries, educated scholars, church officials had denser, darker ink made from imported ingredients. The blacker your letters, the more serious you appeared. Some even had their ink perfumed. Because if you were going to sign decrees and love letters, why not have them smell faintly of cinnamon? And in true Renaissance fashion, a few went overboard. A German count reportedly commissioned an ink recipe of gold and wine. It involved powdered gold leaf, saffron, and sweet white wine. It looked impressive for about 2 minutes, then oxidized into something resembling mustard. But it probably felt luxurious at the time. Let's drift back to the writing table. It's evening in Venice, maybe 1510. The air smells of salt and burning oil lamps. A scribe is mixing a fresh batch of ink in a small ceramic bowl. He stirs it slowly, watching the swirl darken as iron meets tannin. The liquid turns from amber to black, from harmless to eternal. He tests it with a quill, just a stroke on a scrap of paper, too thin. He adds more gum arabic. Another stir, better satisfied. He sets the pot aside to rest. The ink will improve overnight, like soup. When he writes tomorrow, Every letter will start pale and then deepen before his eyes. A living script, drying into permanence beneath a shake of sand. That moment, those seconds of transition, might be the most quietly beautiful part of Renaissance writing. You could literally watch thought turn into matter. But not all inks behaved. Some went sour. Some congealed. Some corroded the quills. A badly mixed batch could ruin weeks of work. So people kept backup recipes. There were soot-based inks, lamp black mixed with gum and water, simpler but less rich. There were colored inks, red from cinnabar or vermilion, blue from azurite, green from verdigris. Each had its own quirks. Red ink often turned brown. Green corroded metal pens. Blue was gorgeous, but absurdly expensive, since it needed crushed gemstones or imported minerals. And then there was the dreaded mold. If you left your ink uncovered, it could grow a fuzzy white film that ruined the mixture. Monks wrote complaints about it in their journals. The ink, being old, hath turned to slime. You can almost hear the despair. What's fascinating is how much ink was tied to identity. Each scribe had a signature color, a thickness, a flow. If you were trained under a certain master, your handwriting and ink were instantly recognizable. It was an extension of your personality. Some rulers had official ink shades for state documents, dark enough to convey authority, but not so black as to suggest gloom. Bureaucracy had style. Even Leonardo da Vinci tinkered with his ink. He experimented with carbon, black, and walnut-based inks, trying to find something smooth enough for his endless sketches. Michelangelo, meanwhile, used brownish ink that bled slightly. His letters look faintly impatient, like the paper couldn't keep up with his hand. And then there were the alchemists, who treated ink-making as part of their secret arts. Recipes survive that call for dragon's blood, actually a red resin, or for the ashes of burned wine corks mixed with honey and bile. Because of course, someone had to add bile. Let's not forget how dangerous ink could be. Iron gall ink, for all its beauty, contained acid. Prolonged contact could burn skin, damage fabric, even corrode metal pen nibs. Scribes often had permanently blackened fingers. Their desks were stained in ghostly outlines of pots and spills. If you spilled a full bottle, it was like an oil slick. You could scrub for hours and still have blue-grey fingerprints a week later. There's a story about an English notary in 1580 who dropped his inkpot across a royal charter. He tried to fix it by blotting it with bread, a common trick, then sanding it dry. The result looked like someone had attacked the document with soup. The king wasn't amused. The notary apparently took up gardening shortly afterward. What's amazing is that despite all the labor, all the spills, people loved this stuff. They trusted it. It was a miracle of permanence in a fragile world. Think about it. A single quill dipped in iron gall ink could outlive its writer by centuries. The letters of Erasmus, the sketches of Da Vinci, the marginal doodles of bored monks, all still readable today. Thanks to that exact same recipe of oak, iron, gum, and patience. There's something oddly poetic about that. Humanity's attempt to make thought tangible, and, of course, accidentally corrosive. Now, while all this ink chemistry was happening, the sand never went away. Even the best ink needed help drying. Some inks took hours to set completely, especially in damp rooms or winter cold. Clerks would stack pages with fine sand between them, like a baker layering flour between sheets of pastry. If you walked into a Renaissance you'd find tables covered in papers glinting faintly under candlelight. all dusted with a sheen of drying grit. And in those moments between writing and drying, between ink and sand, there's a metaphor that the Renaissance would have appreciated: the balance between the fluid and the fixed. Words were alive for only a few seconds before being frozen forever. But before we get to philosophical, let's talk about the quill, because the ink and sand were only half the story. The feather was the third pillar of this delicate ritual. Quills came mostly from geese, swans if you were fancy. They had to be cured, hardened, and shaped with precision. A good quill was like a musician's instrument. It had personality, and pairing the right quill with the right ink was an art. Some writers preferred thick ink that slowed the flow. Others wanted something runnier for faster writing. The wrong combination could be a disaster. Ink too thin. The quill spat. Too thick. The nib clogged. Which is why sand wasn't just for drying. It was also used before writing to prep the quill tip, dusting it so the ink adhered evenly. So yes, sand again. Always sand. It got into everything. The Renaissance was, among other things, a very dusty time. Picture it now, a Venetian merchant's desk, around midnight. The city hums faintly outside. He's writing by lamplight, using ink that smells faintly of wine and rust. His quill scratches, his hand moves carefully, and when he's done, he reaches for the sand pot. One soft shake. The words darken, set, and fall silent. He leans back. Maybe he's writing to a partner in Florence. Maybe a mistress. Maybe he's just balancing accounts. He doesn't know that centuries later, someone will find that same letter in an archive, still legible, still stained faintly with the tiny sand grains that once helped it dry. That's the quiet immortality of ink. So, let's sink a little deeper into this peculiar world of Renaissance ink drying. Picture a quiet study in Florence around the year 1490. The candle's flame sways like it's half asleep. On the table, a half-finished letter, the faint smell of iron gall ink, and beside it, a small, shallow tray filled with something that looks suspiciously like beach sand. But this isn't just any sand. It's the Renaissance equivalent of blotting paper, a tiny desert of powdered quartz, shell, and dust. The last step in turning wet words into something permanent. The process was simple, but a little ritualistic. You'd finish your elegant, sincerely yours, take a pinch of this sand, and gently scatter it across the page like seasoning a delicate dish. Then, with a soft tilt of the paper, you'd let the grains slide off. The sand absorbed just enough moisture to keep the ink from smearing. It didn't dry the ink so much as keep it from being a disaster, and people were obsessed with it. Well, the kind of people who get obsessed with handwriting. The Renaissance version of stationary nerds. These sand mixtures were not all created equal. Wealthier writers had Pounce, a fine powder made from powdered cuttlefish, bone, or ground pumice. Others used plain old sand, sifted until it was fine enough to not scratch the paper. Some blended both, because if you were going to write a love letter or a papal decree, you might as well make sure it dried properly. Now, here's where it gets delightfully ironic. The Renaissance was supposedly this great rebirth of human genius. Michelangelo painting ceilings, Leonardo drawing flying machines, Erasmus reinventing the concept of irony. Yet half of Europe's intellectual output still depended on someone not sneezing on wet ink. All that human brilliance, and still no one had invented blotting paper. Blotting paper wouldn't become common until the 16th century. and even then, it was expensive. So for most of the Renaissance, the sand trick reigned supreme. It worked well enough, unless you were impatient, or clumsy, or, let's be honest, drunk, which was not rare in late-night scriptoriums. There's this quiet charm to imagining those moments. A merchant counting his coins, writing a letter to a partner in Venice, shaking sand over the parchment. The grains fall, like time itself, in slow motion. It's almost poetic. The same element used to measure time in an hourglass, now used to dry the ink, recording it. The Renaissance loved metaphors like that, even if unintentionally. But of course, this isn't just about sand and ink. It's about patience. The physical act of waiting for thoughts to dry, in a world before screens. Before instant send buttons, there was this strange pause between expression and permanence. You wrote something, then had to wait, sometimes minutes, before it could exist safely in the world. That's an oddly beautiful kind of silence, don't you think? And in that waiting, people fidgeted. They tapped quills, they reheated candles, they adjusted sand trays, and they thought. Maybe that's why Renaissance letters often read like mini-essays. You had time to think between sentences. Every comma was an act of drying. Now, as for the sand itself, it came from everywhere. Italy imported fine sand from riverbeds, especially from the Arno near Florence. The English used something called silver sand, a pale glimmering quartz from the coast. The French favoured crushed seashells, poetic, but probably terrible for your quill tips. And if you were really fancy, you perfumed your sand. Yes, some people added rosewater or lavender oil so that their drying medium smelled pleasant while they wrote. Because nothing says Renaissance sophistication like fragrant dirt. Let's also not forget the containers, the sanders or pounce pots. These were often made of pewter, ceramic, or glass. Some were elaborately carved with holes on top so you could shake out the sand like a salt shaker. Others looked suspiciously like miniature spice jars. And they were personal objects. A scribe's sander could be as treasured as his inkwell. People gave them as gifts. Imagine giving someone sand as a birthday present today. The 1500s were wild, but there's another layer to all this: social status. Having fine sand and clean paper wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. The ability to write neatly and beautifully reflected education and refinement. Smudged ink meant carelessness. A good drawing technique was, in a way, moral virtue on paper. So, when you read one of those impossibly tidy Renaissance letters, with every loop and line precise, you're not just seeing good penmanship. You're seeing discipline, patience, and a very steady hand that knew how to sprinkle sand without spilling half of Tuscany onto the desk. Let's not romanticize it too much, though. Writing was messy. Ink splattered, sand got everywhere, and quills broke constantly. People cursed at their tools then, just as we curse at autocorrect now. The Renaissance might look elegant in hindsight, but in reality, it was just a lot of people trying to get their thoughts down before the ink dried crooked dot now. While the upper classes were fussing with imported sand, the common scribes and clerks had their own tricks. Some simply blew on their words. Not very effective, but free. Others used ash from the fireplace. It worked, kind of. Though one can imagine the charming grey smudges it left behind. Even monks in monasteries. Those eternal perfectionists of handwriting sometimes used sand. The scriptoria were like sandboxes of holiness, each grain helping preserve sacred words. There's something oddly fitting about that. The idea that divine text was once gently buried, just for a moment, in a whisper of earth. As the Renaissance moved along, paper itself started to change, too. Early papers were rough and absorbed ink unpredictably. That's why sand was essential. But as paper making improved, the surface became smoother and inks were refined. Slowly, the need for sand began to fade. Still, even as blotting paper appeared, some old-fashioned souls refused to give it up. Habit dies slowly, especially in history. There are accounts from the 17th century of aging clerks still shaking their little sand, pots like stubborn relics of a gritty past. You can almost hear them muttering, "It worked fine in my day." And perhaps it did, because there's something satisfyingly tactile about the old way. The tiny hiss of grains falling, the soft scrape as they're brushed off. Writing was a full sensory experience. The sound of the quill, the smell of the ink, the feel of the paper, and the weight of the sand. Every letter was a small act of craftsmanship. Let's drift for a moment, though, to another angle, the symbolism of sand. Renaissance thinkers loved allegory. Sand represented impermanence, time, fragility. And yet, here it was, used to make words last. A paradox wrapped in a desk accessory. The same substance that measured time in an hourglass was used to preserve it in ink. Leonardo da Vinci, ever the multitasker, likely knew this trick too. His notebooks, with their reversed handwriting and sketches, were full of ink that would have needed careful drying. We don't have direct notes of him mentioning sand, but it's hard to imagine the man who invented helicopters forgetting to let his words dry properly. Besides, his habit of writing backward meant he couldn't risk smearing anything. One wrong move and his secret mirror script would turn into a very expensive Rorschach test. So yes, even geniuses dealt with ink drying. Humanity's progress, it seems, has always been 1 part brilliance and 2 parts waiting for things to set. Let's float now to the printing houses of Venice. There, amid pressers and apprentices running around with inky hands, sand had another purpose. It was sprinkled on freshly printed sheets to prevent offsetting, where wet ink transfers from one page to another. Printers called it dusting, and they had entire rooms devoted to drying. The smell of oil-based ink, the soft rustle of pages, and yes, that ever-present grit. It was like the smell of progress, if progress had a texture. Of course, printers being printers, they complained endlessly about sand. It stuck to everything, jammed machines, got into the ink. They dreamed of cleaner methods, and soon they'd get them. But not yet. Not while the Renaissance still lingered, clinging to its graceful imperfections. By the late 1500s, some writers began using Pounce, not just for drying, but for preparing paper. They'd dust a sheet before writing to make it less absorbent. It gave smoother lines, cleaner curves. So now, sand wasn't just for finishing words. It was part of making them look beautiful in the first place. You can almost see the evolution happening in slow motion. Rough paper, thick ink, coarse sand. Then finer grains, smoother surfaces, more control. The Renaissance was obsessed with control over art, science, even the written word. And sand, humble as it was, fit right into that ideal. By the time blotting paper truly took over in the 17th century, the sander had become an antique curiosity. Yet, many kept theirs on the desk, maybe out of habit, maybe as a reminder of quieter times when you had to wait for your words to dry. And really, that's not such a bad thing to remember, because in our modern rush, tapping keys, sending messages, deleting regrets. We've lost that small ritual of stillness, the moment between thought and permanence, the moment when sand whispered over ink. Maybe that's what made Renaissance writing feel so deliberate. Every letter cost effort. Every sentence required patience. Every word carried the weight of drying time. So, next time you pick up a pen, or, more likely, your phone, think of that Florentine desk. The candlelight, the faint glimmer of sand, and the gentle pause before the ink settles forever. Let's wander away from the desks of scholars and into the dim corridors of Renaissance monasteries. The air is heavy with the smell of ink, wax, and something vaguely earthy, probably because there's still sand all over the place. Here, in the echoing scriptoria, time moved differently. You could spend hours copying a single page. No rush, no chatter, just the soft rasp of a quill against parchment and the occasional clink of a sand pot being tapped. If meditation had a soundtrack, this was it. Monks were the original text processors. They sat bent over pages, carefully tracing letters that had already been written hundreds of times before. It wasn't creative work, at least, not in the modern sense. It was preservation, a slow, reverent act of keeping words alive through repetition, and every word had to dry perfectly. Imagine spending 6 hours copying a psalm, only to smear the ink on the last line because you leaned too close. A single smudge could ruin a whole day's effort, so sand became sacred in a quiet, practical way. You could say salvation depended on proper ink drying. Some monasteries even had rules about it. Don't overuse sand. Don't shake it near the holy books. Don't blow on the ink, that's unhygienic. The level of control was astonishing, but then again, so was the level of boredom. It's easy to see why they found spiritual meaning in something as ordinary as drying words. There's something almost hypnotic about that image. An endless line of men in robes, their faces lit by candlelight. Tiny mountains of sand pots beside them. It's easy to romanticize, but truthfully, it must have been exhausting. Writing, drying, turning pages, over and over, day after day. The great chain of human memory held together by people who couldn't even sign their own names differently. The Renaissance, for all its glory, didn't erase that medieval backbone. Behind every beautiful book was a monk, and behind every monk was a small pile of sand. Let's not forget that ink itself was temperamental. Iron gall ink, the most common kind, was like a moody friend, dark, beautiful, but corrosive. It was made from tannins from oak galls, iron salts, and a little gum arabic. It soaked deep into parchment, almost burning its way in. When wet, it was rich and glossy. When dry, it turned a flat brownish black, and if you weren't careful, it could literally eat through your page. So yes, drying mattered. Not too fast, not too slow. Too much sand, and it would dull the color. Too little, and it would smear. The balance was delicate, an alchemy of patience. Let's float now from the monks to the merchants. The Renaissance wasn't just an age of art. It was also an age of bureaucracy. Every transaction, every shipment, every debt written down. Entire cities ran on ink and sand. Picture a Venetian trade office around 1530. Papers everywhere. Clerks hunched over desks, the faint sound of quills scratching like 1,000 tiny insects. They weren't writing poetry. They were calculating shiploads of pepper and bolts of silk. And between each line of cramped handwriting, Someone's hand hovers, sprinkling sand, waiting for it to dry before folding the page. It's oddly comforting to realize that human frustration hasn't changed much in 500 years. You think waiting for a PDF to load is bad. Try waiting for ink to dry in humid Venice. Of course, merchants weren't nearly as careful as monks. Their letters were often blotchy, their sand reused until it looked like coffee grounds. But speed mattered more than beauty. A late payment notice didn't need perfect calligraphy, just legibility. And yet, even they kept sanders on their desks, often plain brass ones, dented and worn smooth from years of use. If you were wealthy though, your writing tools became part of your image. Renaissance nobles didn't just write, they performed writing. Their desks were miniature museums of status, ornate ink, quills with silver tips, sheets of imported paper, and, of course, elegant Pounce pots made of ivory or porcelain. Some were engraved with family crests, others shaped like animals. There's one in the Medici collection shaped like a lion's paw, as if every word written beside it had claws. That's the Renaissance for you. Even sand had to look impressive, but beyond the luxury and vanity, there's something universally human here. Writing is one of those acts that ties everyone together. Monks, merchants, nobles. They all faced the same small problem. Ink takes time, and no amount of wealth or faith could make it dry faster. Even Leonardo, genius that he was, would have had to wait. He could design flying machines and mechanical lions, but he still had to sprinkle sand on his notes like everyone else. There's something beautifully humbling about that now. If we step into the home of a Renaissance artist or scholar, the scene shifts slightly. The air smells of pigment and parchment. On the table, sketches and notes overlap in messy piles. The sand here isn't decorative, it's survival. Artists mixed it into pigments to texture their paints. Writers used it to dry their drafts. It was the universal dust of creativity. Let's not forget, sand wasn't just functional, it was symbolic. In Renaissance philosophy, sand often represented the fleeting nature of human life. You see it in hourglasses, in vanitous paintings, in sermons about mortality. Memento mori, they said. Remember that you must die. And yet here they were, using the same symbol of impermanence to preserve their words. It's the kind of irony the Renaissance excelled at. Profound, poetic, and slightly absurd. If you visit certain old libraries today, you can still find traces of this world. Faint scratches on parchment where sand once slid off. Tiny grains trapped in the bindings of old books. Fossilized proof that someone, centuries ago, shook a handful of earth over a wet sentence and waited. Maybe impatiently, maybe tenderly, maybe both, and that's what gives those books their quiet intimacy. They aren't just records of what people thought. They're records of how they worked, how they moved, how they waited. Each letter carries not just ink, but time. When you think about it, writing in the Renaissance was a kind of slow-motion performance. You dipped your quill, shaped a word, breathed, sprinkled sand, paused. Every page was a little ritual of control over chaos. And that's what the whole era was about, turning mess into meaning. Let's take a soft turn toward the material side, the desks, the tools. The little world built around writing. A proper Renaissance desk wasn't just a slab of wood. It was a small ecosystem. You'd have your inkwell, usually filled with iron gall ink or sepia. A quill or two, sharpened with a small knife. A wax candle, of course. maybe a sand tray or a shaker with a perforated lid. And if you were wealthy or paranoid, a seal stamp for your letters. The sand often sat in a shallow dish lined with velvet or leather to keep it from slipping. You'd shake it lightly across the page, then tilt the desk to collect it again. It was oddly satisfying, like resetting a tiny world after each paragraph. Some sanders had multiple compartments, one for clean sand, one for used. People really did recycle their sand, which tells you everything you need to know about Renaissance thriftiness. You could tell a lot about a person from their sand. Fine white grains, educated, refined, coarse and dark, practical, probably a clerk, colored or perfumed, definitely trying too hard in some portraits of scholars. You can actually spot the sand pot beside the inkwell, a silent detail that says, yes, this man's thoughts were valuable enough to need drying. Even paintings understood that sand was part of the intellectual aesthetic. It's tempting to think of all this as outdated, but really, the ritual hasn't gone away. We've just changed tools. The sand is now a progress bar. The ink drying is a file saving. The same quiet wait between thought and permanence still exists, only faster, noisier, and less graceful. The Renaissance knew something we'd forgotten. That slowness wasn't a flaw. It was the price of care, so the next time you see a blot-free letter from 1500, remember, someone sat there in flickering candlelight, hand steady, sand at the ready, waiting for the moment their thoughts would dry enough to live forever. Let's drift next into how this simple act, drying ink, quietly shaped art, science, and communication across Europe, because sometimes the smallest tools leave the biggest marks. Now, let's consider the humble letter, the lifeblood of Renaissance communication. Letters weren't casual notes. They were performances on paper. Every word carefully weighed, every line positioned for maximum effect. A single smudge could change the tone, and smudges were a constant threat because, despite all our talk of quills and ink, the real unsung hero was still the sand. When a letter was finished, a writer wouldn't simply fold it and send it. No, the Renaissance demanded ceremony. First, the ink had to dry, patiently, deliberately. A scribe might sprinkle sand over the page, tap it gently to settle the grains, then brush off the excess. Sometimes the paper was stacked with layers of sand between sheets to prevent smearing. The result was a quiet, tactile satisfaction, a page that seemed to have earned its permanence. Once dry, the letter might be folded into intricate shapes, sometimes sealed with wax, sometimes tied with ribbon. The seal wasn't just decoration. It protected the words, ensured authenticity, and also served as a subtle threat. Don't smudge this, or face consequences. The sand had done its job by this point, but the ritual continued, and it wasn't only letters. Consider the notebooks of artists and scientists. Leonardo da Vinci, for example, was constantly sketching and writing in a secret mirror script. He had to be meticulous about ink drying. A single smear could render a page unreadable, possibly ruining years of experiments and observations. His notebooks are dense, chaotic, yet meticulously controlled. And in those dense lines, somewhere, sand has likely kissed nearly every page. Artists faced similar issues. Sketches made in ink, birds, machines, architectural plans were fragile. Wet ink on vellum or paper was a ticking clock. Sand, in its gentle, silent way, allowed creativity to linger just long enough to to become permanent. Even scientists relied on the ritual. Recipes for alchemical experiments, medical observations, botanical drawings, all were inked by hand. Wet ink was a risk. Smudging could destroy measurements or notes. Sand, unassuming and universal, kept the fragile record intact. It's funny how the Renaissance, this age of intellectual expansion, was so dependent on a substance as banal as sand. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't celebrated. Yet it quietly shaped the trajectory of art, science, and correspondence, one tiny grain at a time. Let's pause to visualize a scriptorium in its full glory. High ceilings, sunlight streaming through stained glass, casting colored light on dust motes drifting lazily in the air. Long tables lined with scholars bent over manuscripts, quills scratching, pages rustling, faint clinks of sandpots tapping against their bases. You might imagine it serene, which in context it probably was, except for the occasional sneezes, coughs, and low mutters of frustration. And here's the human element, patience. The Renaissance required it daily. Everything took time. Words didn't fly from brain to paper instantly. Pages didn't dry instantly. Thoughts weren't sent by pigeon, though those existed too. Every act of writing demanded slow, deliberate care, and every careful act demanded sand. It's humbling, really. Modern life is a blur of instant messages, emails, and digital notifications. We think we're fast and efficient, but the Renaissance reminds us that there is beauty in slowness, that small pauses, even something as mundane as letting ink dry under grains of sand, are the foundation of lasting work. And yes, there were mistakes. Humans are prone to them. A clumsy shake could spill sand over the wrong line. A quill could splay ink in unexpected blotches. A sneeze could send grains scattering across several sheets. But these were accepted risks. Part of the ritual. Part of the charm, in fact. Some scribes developed subtle strategies to minimize disaster. Pages were often rotated after sand was sprinkled, letting grains settle naturally. Fingers were brushed gently along the edges to sweep away excess. And when nothing else worked, you folded the page cleverly, so blotches wouldn't ruin the visible script. Even in the age of printing, the habits persisted. Early print shops still used sand to prevent ink transfer between sheets. Old habits die slowly, especially when they work. Consider the social dimension too. Sand wasn't just a tool, it was a statement. If you were careless with ink, if your letters smudged, it reflected poorly on you. Precision signaled education, refinement, and reliability. Even merchants, whose primary concern was profit, understood that a smudged ledger could lead to disaster. Thus, sand was quietly democratizing. It leveled the field between monks and merchants, nobles and clerks. Everyone who wrote had to respect it. Everyone learned its subtle language. Sprinkle lightly, wait, brush, miss a step, and the message suffers. It's a lesson that resonates even now. Technology changes, but the principle remains. Lasting work requires care. Even tiny, overlooked rituals, like sand on wet ink, can make all the difference. By the late Renaissance, the landscape had changed slightly. Papers were smoother, inks were refined, and blotting paper began to appear. But the influence of sand lingered. Some artists and scribes preferred it to blotting paper, arguing that it produced a more natural line. Old masters clung to tradition. They knew that slow, deliberate work yielded beauty, and nothing, not innovation, not convenience, could replace the quiet patience of sprinkling grains and watching ink set. It's oddly poetic. Humanity's desire for permanence, shaped by something as ephemeral as sand. Words, once liquid, solidified under a tiny, granular shower. And those grains, scattered across the centuries, still whisper of patience, care, and the uncelebrated art